The sound of heavy metal dragging against cold stone wasn't just noise, it was the clock of death. Absolute darkness made a man forget if it was day or night, if he was alive, or if he had already descended into Sheol. What were prisons actually like in the time of Jesus, over 2,000 years ago? Forget individual cells with iron beds or courtyards for sunbathing. The archaeological reality of the first century reveals a much more terrifying scenario, where architecture served not to rehabilitate, but to break the human spirit before the whip even touched the skin. For centuries, our idea of prison has changed drastically. Today, we think of long sentences, of years served behind bars as payment for a crime. But to understand the biblical world, we must deconstruct this modern image. In the Roman Empire and ancient Judea, prison was not the punishment itself. It was merely the antechamber of pain. No one heard a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment. The dungeon served solely to hold the body, to ensure the accused was present to receive their final verdict. A heavy fine, scourging, being sold into slavery, or public execution. Prison was limbo, an agonizing waiting place where time stood still and fear grew. Stay until the end, because understanding the engineering of these prisons profoundly changes the reading of crucial gospel passages, from the imprisonment of John the Baptist to Jesus' agonizing night at the house of Caiaphas. Let us descend now into the basements of history. In the first century, there were no penitentiaries built with sanitary planning. Prisons were terrible improvisations, taking advantage of geography and existing structures. In Judea, the most common form of incarceration was the empty cistern. Imagine a hole dug deep into limestone rock, originally designed to store rainwater. When the water dried up or the cistern cracked, it became the perfect dungeon. These were bottle-shaped pits, narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. The prisoner was lowered by ropes, or often thrown inside. Once at the bottom, looking up meant seeing only a small, distant circle of light, unreachable. There were no stairs, no side doors. Escape was physically impossible. The environment down there was an assault on all senses. The floor was never dry. It was covered in fetid mud, a mixture of silt, rotting food scraps, and human waste accumulated for months or years. The air was heavy, stale, low in oxygen, and thick with the smell of ammonia and disease. Archaeology confirms that ventilation in these spaces was practically non-existent. Breathing in there was, in itself, a slow punishment. The darkness was almost tactile. Without torches or lamps, luxuries denied to prisoners, total darkness disoriented the brain, causing hallucinations and the loss of any sense of time. The prisoner did not know if they had been there for an hour or a week. But the rural cistern was not the only model. In Jerusalem and the great Herodian fortresses, there was the Roman casa. These were cells located in the subterranean levels of military barracks or government palaces. The Antonia fortress, where Paul would later be detained, and where Jesus was likely judged by Pilate, possessed these structures. There, the cruelty was more sophisticated. The prisoner was rarely left loose in the cell. Roman surveillance relied on iron, not walls. The inmate remained chained 24 hours a day. There were different degrees of containment. Sometimes, chains bound the prisoner's wrist to a guard's wrist, a forced and humiliating intimacy. In other cases, short chains linked the ankles, allowing only tiny, shuffling steps. But the most feared instrument, found in excavations and ancient descriptions, was the stocks, a block of heavy wood with holes where the prisoner's legs were inserted and locked. The jailer could decide the distance between the legs. The wider the separation, the greater the agony in the hips and spine. Men were left in this unnatural position for days, unable to stand, clean themselves, or sleep, causing muscle cramps so violent they made the prisoner beg for death. It was exactly in such a hostile environment that John the Baptist, the precursor, spent his final days. The accounts of Flavius Josephus indicate he was held at the fortress of Machaerus, an isolated citadel east of the Dead Sea. The contrast could not be more cruel. Outside, the desert sun burned, and the landscape was vast. Inside, in the bowels of the fortress, John experienced damp cold and total confinement. For a man who lived his entire life in the freedom of the wilderness, wearing skins and eating what nature provided, prison was devastating psychological torture. When we read in the Gospel that John, from inside the prison, sends word to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect another?" we are not seeing a lack of faith. We are seeing the result of months of sensory deprivation, darkness, and physical suffering trying to break the mind of a prophet. And there was a cruel logistical detail that many ignore today. The Roman system did not provide adequate food for common prisoners. The state did not spend its resources to keep criminals or rebels alive and healthy. The official ration, when it existed, was barely enough to prevent immediate starvation. A piece of hard bread and dirty water. Real survival depended entirely on outside solidarity. If the prisoner did not have family, friends, or a religious community willing to risk going to the prison gates to bring food, clean clothes, or a blanket, they would die. This transformed prison into a collective test. Visiting a prisoner was dangerous. It meant exposing oneself to Roman guards, paying bribes to ensure the food reached the cell, and often being associated with the inmate's crime. When Jesus says, "I was in prison and you visited me," he is describing an act of extreme social courage. Bringing bread to a prisoner was saying to Rome, "I care about this man whom you despise." Therefore, prison isolated the body, but survival required the community to break that isolation. The silence of these places was only broken by moans of pain, the sound of chains, and the hacking cough of respiratory diseases that spread quickly in the confined air. There were no doctors. If a wound became infected due to the friction of rusted iron shackles, which was extremely common, gangrene would set in, and the prisoner would rot alive before even seeing the judge. Natural death inside the dungeon was frequent and treated with indifference. The body was removed like trash, and the vacancy was immediately filled by another unfortunate soul captured in the dusty streets of Judea. This was the reality of the wait, but eventually the door would open. Sunlight would pour in, stinging eyes accustomed to the gloom. A name was called. The prisoner, weak, filthy, and trembling, was dragged out. The scent of fresh air mingled with the smell of fear. Because leaving prison did not mean freedom, it meant the real process was about to begin. The judicial system of the time had no eloquent defense attorneys or impartial juries as we see in movies. The trial was fast, public, and most of the time, brutally visual. When the heavy wooden door or the stone sealing the cistern finally moved, the first impact was not relief, but physical pain in the eyes. After weeks in the absolute darkness of the dungeon, the Middle Eastern sunlight pierced the retina like a hot needle. The prisoner, covered in filth, blinked disorientedly, trying to focus on the shapes around him while being jerked roughly to the surface. The silence of the cell was instantly replaced by the chaotic roar of the city. The smell of spices, animals, and the crowd's sweat invaded his sensitive nose. He wasn't being taken to a private air-conditioned room with lawyers in suits. He was being dragged to the center of the spectacle, the public trial. In the ancient world, justice did not hide behind walls. It had to be seen to be feared. The Roman tribunal, known as the bema or judgment seat, was an elevated structure, often built in a public square or at the entrance of government palaces. It was a high stone platform, clad in polished marble that gleamed under the unforgiving sun. This elevation was not just aesthetic, it was a tool of psychological intimidation. The judge, whether a Roman governor like Pontius Pilate or a local magistrate, sat on the sella curulis, the ivory and metal chair, looking down. The defendant, standing at ground level, dirty and chained, had to crane his neck, exposing his throat in a forced gesture of submission, just to face the authority who held the power of life and death. The dynamics of this trial were terrifying for a simple man from Galilee or Judea. There was no presumption of innocence, as we understand it today. If you were there, before the governor, it was because someone already considered you guilty of something. The Roman system prioritized order, the Pax Romana, above individual justice. The governor held imperium, absolute power. He did not need to consult a jury. He heard the accusations, looked at the defendant, and decided. The process was fast, efficient, and brutal. In a matter of minutes, a man's fate was sealed. There was no appeal for non-citizens. The word of Rome was final and irrevocable. But in first century Judea, there was an extra layer of complexity, the law of Moses. Before reaching Rome, many passed through the religious scrutiny of the Sanhedrin. Jewish justice operated differently, but just as rigorously. The religious court met in a semicircle where the judges could see each other and the accused. Here, eyewitness testimony was king. The law required that, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every truth should be established. A single witness was worth nothing. This created a dangerous market for false testimony, where words could be bought for silver coins, turning truth into a commodity. It was exactly in this clash between 2 legal systems that the most famous trial in history took place. Jesus was dragged first to the religious authorities in a process full of nighttime irregularities, and then taken to Pilate's bema. The place, called in Greek Lithostrotos and in Hebrew Gabbatha, the stone pavement, still echoes in the archaeology of Jerusalem. Imagine the sound of soldiers' sandals clicking on the stone floor, the murmur of the accusing crowd pressing against the barriers, shouting to influence the judge's decision. The trial was not silent. It was an arena of voices. Popular pressure functioned as a weapon. A Roman governor, though powerful, feared a riot. If the crowd screamed loud enough, technical justice could be ignored in favor of political convenience. And the accused, what could he do? There were rarely lawyers. The prisoner spoke for himself. Rhetoric was an art, and those who could not speak well, who stuttered from fear, or who remained silent, like the lamb before the shearers, often sealed their own condemnation. Jesus' silence before Pilate was something that broke protocol. The Roman governor was used to seeing men begging, crying, promising bribes, or blaming others. The dignified silence, the refusal to play the game of fear, was something that destabilized imperial authority, for it showed a power that Rome could not control. Once the verdict was given, the sentence was not 10 years of forced labor. Ancient prisons, as we have seen, did not serve for long sentences. Punishment was corporal and immediate. The body of the condemned paid the debt right then and there. It could be an extortionate fine that enslaved the entire family for generations. It could be mutilation, the loss of a hand or an eye, following the literal logic of eye for an eye. Or it could be capital punishment. But before death, there was an intermediate stage designed to destroy the will to live and prepare the body for the end. When Pilate, sitting on his elevated tribunal, washed his hands and handed Jesus over, he did not send him immediately to the cross. He sent him to the inner courtyard for preliminary punishment. And it is here that Roman justice revealed its most sadistic face. The law permitted torture not only as punishment, but as a method of interrogation and humiliation. The condemned prisoner ceased to be seen as human. He became an object in the hands of the lictors, the empire's specialists in pain. The crowd that watched the trial now dispersed or prepared to follow the procession, but the prisoner remained behind in the hands of the cohort. The transition from the tribunal to the scourging courtyard was the passage from psychological fear to absolute physical terror. What happened in those closed courtyards, away from the eyes of the general public, but under the watchful gaze of soldiers making bets and mocking, was a science of the destruction of the flesh. The verdict had been given. The word had been spoken. Now, metal and leather would speak louder. The body, already weakened by prison, lack of food, and the tension of the trial, was about to meet the Flagrum. It was not just a whip. It was a tool designed by engineers of pain to ensure that the prisoner, if he survived, would never be the same again. The death sentence was already terrible, but the path to it was paved with pieces of the condemned's own flesh, torn away violently. Prepare yourself, for what we are about to describe is not for the faint of heart. It is the exact anatomy of how Rome broke a man before killing him. The sound heard in the inner courtyard of the fortress was not human. It was the sharp crack of leather cutting the air, followed by the muffled, wet impact against flesh. If the prison was the weight and the trial was the sentence, the scourging was the partial execution. Roman justice was fast, visible, and designed to leave permanent marks. The most common punishment, and perhaps the most feared before death, was not a simple beating. We are talking about the flagrum. Do not think of the long, thin whips from Hollywood movies. The flagrum was a piece of torture, short, robust, and scientifically designed to cause maximum damage with minimum effort from the executioner. It consisted of a thick wooden handle from which several strips of braided leather hung. But the terrible secret lay in the tips. At the end of each strip, the Romans tied sharp pieces of sheep bone or small balls of solid lead, known as plumbatae. When the Roman soldier, trained in the art of inflicting pain, swung his arm and brought the flagrum down upon the prisoner's back, physics took over. The lead balls gained velocity and, upon hitting the body, did not just strike the skin. They contused the muscle deeply, bursting subcutaneous blood vessels and creating massive internal bruises instantly. But that was only the first blow. When the soldier pulled the whip back to prepare the next attack, the sheep bones came into play. The sharp tips hooked into the skin and soft flesh of the back, tearing everything in their path. The flagrum did not just hit and bounce back. It hit, dug in, and ripped out. With each successive blow, the skin of the back was literally dismantled. What began as superficial cuts quickly transformed into deep lacerations that exposed red musculature and, in extreme cases, even revealed the whiteness of the ribs and spine. The ground around the prisoner became slippery with his own blood. Here we must make a crucial historical distinction. Jewish law, based on the mercy of the Book of Deuteronomy, had a strict limit. It said, 40 lashes he may give him, but not more. To ensure the law was not broken by a counting error, the Jews stopped at the 39th blow. It was the famous 40 minus 1. There was a judge counting aloud and a doctor examining the defendant between blows to see if he could endure the next one. If the prisoner was too weak, the punishment stopped. The intention was to correct, not to kill. But Jesus was not scourged under Jewish law. He was handed over to Roman soldiers. And Rome had no limits. The Roman scourging, the verberatio, stopped only when the executioner grew tired or when the centurion in charge decided the prisoner was already too close to death to remain useful. There was no count. There was no mercy. 2 soldiers, one on each side, took turns, striking the prisoner tied to a low column or post, ensuring the blows wrapped around the entire torso, hitting the chest and abdomen as the leather strips embraced the body. The goal was not just unbearable physical pain, it was the spectacle. The punishment happened before the eyes of other soldiers, and sometimes the public. The body of the condemned became a living warning. The blood, the hoarse screams that turned into groans, and the exposure of human anatomy served to maintain imperial order through absolute terror. The shame was as painful as the wound. A man scourged in this manner lost his honor, his strength, and his dignity before his community. He became a broken thing. And it is exactly in this context of technical brutality that the Gospels narrate the suffering of Jesus. Pilate orders the scourging in a cruel political attempt. He wanted to present Jesus to the crowd in a state so deplorable, so destroyed, that it would evoke pity or satisfy the bloodlust without having to kill him. "Behold the man," he said, pointing to a figure who could barely stand, covered by a purple robe that stuck to open wounds. But the human body has limits. Massive blood loss led to hypovolemic shock. The heart began to beat erratically, trying to pump what little blood remained to vital organs. Thirst became unbearable. The skin grew pale and cold. Dizziness made the world spin. The prisoner entered a state of pre-collapse. And ironically, if he survived all this, the worst was yet to come. Because for Rome, the scourging, with all its barbarity, was often just the prelude. If the defendant was condemned to the ultimate penalty, he would have to carry his own instrument of death with a raw back. The cross did not wait for a healthy man. It waited for a man who was already dying. And it is toward this final walk, dragging the weight of wood over open wounds, that we turn our gaze now. The path of the Via Dolorosa was not just a walk, it was torture in motion. But there was a fate worse than scourging. For the worst criminals, for the political rebels who dared to challenge Caesar's authority, and for those Rome wanted to erase from history, there was the cross. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. The Persians and Carthaginians already used it, but it was the Roman Empire that perfected it, transforming it into the supreme machine of slow torture and calculated death. Unlike prison, which hid the man in darkness so no one would see him, the cross elevated him above the heads of the crowd so all could see his final agony in detail. It was the ultimate theater of state terror. The condemned, already brutally wounded by the flagrum, did not carry the entire cross, as many Renaissance paintings suggest. The vertical piece, called the stipes, was already fixed at the execution site, awaiting its victim. What the prisoner carried on his raw shoulders was the patibulum, the heavy horizontal wooden beam, which could weigh up to 50 kilograms, 110 lbs. Imagine the friction of rough, splintered wood rubbing against an open back where muscles were already exposed. Every step of the walk to the execution site, Golgotha, was a superhuman effort. Tripping meant falling with the full weight of the wood onto the face or chest, crushing the air from the lungs. Upon reaching the site, technical cruelty took over. The prisoner was stripped. Total nudity was an essential part of Roman punishment. The goal was to humiliate the man, stripping him of any vestige of dignity or social status. Lying on the ground, with arms spread over the patibulum, he saw the nails. Biblical archaeology gave us a rare and terrifying glimpse of this in 1968, when ossuaries were found in Jerusalem containing the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan. An iron nail was still driven through the heel bone. These Roman nails were between 11 and 18 centimeters long. They were square, crude iron spikes. When the nail pierced the wrist, and not the palm of the hand, which would not support the body's weight, it struck the median nerve. This is the nerve responsible for hand movement and sensitivity. The shock of pain was like a constant lightning bolt traveling up the arm to the neck. It was a pain so specific and intense that the Romans had to invent a new word to describe it: excruciating, which literally means from the cross. Next, the feet were nailed, often piercing the tarsal bones, fixing the man to the vertical wood. But death on the cross did not come from bleeding from the nails. That would be too fast. Death came by asphyxiation. With arms outstretched and the body hanging, the ribcage was in a position of permanent inhalation. Air entered the lungs, but the prisoner could not exhale it. To release the air and breathe again, he had to make a desperate effort. Push his body upward, supporting all his weight on the nails driven into his wounded feet. The pain in the feet was unbearable, but necessary to catch a single breath of life. Thus began what forensic doctors call the dance of death. The crucified man rose on the nails of his feet to breathe. The pain became unbearable, and he collapsed his body back down, hanging by his wrists, which prevented breathing again. Up to breathe, down to relieve the pain. Up, down, up, down. This agonizing cycle repeated hundreds, thousands of times for hours or even days. The sun burned the skin. Insects landed on the open wounds of the eyes and face, and the prisoner could not shoo them away. Thirst, caused by blood loss and sweat, made the tongue swollen and dry as sandpaper. Each breath required a conscious decision to suffer more pain, to live a few more seconds. It was a death designed to last. Roman soldiers sometimes broke the legs of the condemned, crucifixum, not out of mercy, but to hasten death if they needed to leave. Without legs to support themselves, the condemned could no longer lift themselves to breathe and died of suffocation in minutes. It was forbidden to bury a crucified person with honor. Roman law dictated that the body should be left on the cross to rot, serving as food for vultures and wild dogs. It was total annihilation, physical, social, and spiritual. The man did not just die, he disappeared, denied final rest with his ancestors. However, the biblical narrative shows us the shocking break from this pattern. Jesus, who passed through the dark prison, who endured the Flagrum, and who now hung dead on the cross, received unexpected final treatment. Where Rome expected disposal, history was about to change. The silence of death descended upon Golgotha, but this silence would not be the end. Something was about to happen to that body that would defy all the laws of Rome and of nature itself. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy and influential man, risked his own position and safety by entering Pilate's praetorium. Asking for the body of a man condemned for treason was an act of political courage. Pilate, surprised that Jesus was already dead so quickly, as the cross usually took days to kill, granted the body. What followed was an absolute contrast to the violence of the last 12 hours. Where there was iron tearing skin, there were now careful hands removing nails. Where there was blood and sweat, there was now clean water and myrrh. The body destroyed by the justice of men was wrapped in pure linen and placed in a new tomb, hewn out of living rock, where no one had ever been laid. But the system did not give up. The paranoia of religious leaders and the power of Rome joined for one last security measure: sealing the stone. Jesus' tomb was closed with a large circular stone weighing perhaps 1 or 2 tons and marked with the Roman imperial seal. Guards were posted at the entrance. The logic was the same as the prisons described at the beginning: containment, surveillance, and control. They wanted to ensure that the movement died there, locked in the dark. just as John the Baptist had been locked in the cistern. Death was sealed with bureaucracy and military force. For the humanity of that time, that was the definitive end. However, the system of prisons and punishments from 2,000 years ago, built to crush the human spirit through fear and pain, found its limit on the morning of the third day. Chains bound, the whip tore, and the cross killed. It was the triumph of brute force. But paradoxically, it was by enduring exactly these punishments, the unjust imprisonment, the illegal scourging, and the shameful capital penalty, that the history of the Christian faith was sealed. What was an instrument of torture became a symbol of redemption. The prison could not contain the message. The whip did not silence the truth. The stone, rolled to close, became an open door, and the cross, designed to be a shameful end, became the new beginning of everything. Archaeology and history show us the cold stones, the rusted nails, and the dark dungeons where so many perished. But they also show us the empty tomb. The system failed. Life conquered the engineering of death. If this documentary has made you see biblical history with new eyes, if you felt the weight of the chains and the hope of the resurrection, do not leave without leaving your mark. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell, because we are just beginning to excavate the secrets of the past. Like this video so the algorithm carries this message to more people who need to know the historical truth. And I want to know your opinion. Which part of these ancient punishments shocked you the most? The Roman scourge or the darkness of the cistern? Comment below. I read and respond to the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. May truth accompany your journey, and until the next video.